War is not the only architect of ruin. The loudest explosions are not always the ones that level cities. There is a quieter, more insidious form of destruction, one that begins not on a battlefield, but in the labyrinth of a single human mind. An idea, nurtured in silence, can become a weapon more potent than any army, capable of dismantling societies, enslaving populations, and leading millions to their doom, all without the firing of a single shot. This is a journey beyond the trenches and the front lines. It is an exploration into the shadows where power is wielded not with steel, but with words, not with force, but with faith, not with cannons, but with charisma. We will dissect the legacies of men who were not generals, but ideologues, not conquerors, but controllers. They were the master puppeteers, the psychological tyrants, the shadow architects of human suffering. Their names may not all be household words, but their influence is etched into the darkest chapters of our history. They are a chilling reminder that the capacity for immense evil can be found in the most brilliant, persuasive, and convinced of minds. They prove that when intellect is divorced from empathy, when conviction is untethered from morality, the human mind itself becomes the most dangerous place on earth. We begin in the heartland of America, in the fertile soil of hope and discontent, where a man would rise from obscurity to become a self-proclaimed Messiah. He promised a heaven on earth, a sanctuary from the sins of a divided world. But the path to his paradise led only to a clearing in a remote jungle, and to an end so horrific it would forever be seared into the collective consciousness. This is the story of James Warren Jones and the deadly gravity of his will. Jim Jones was born in 1931 in the rural backwater of Crete, Indiana, a world away from the jungle commune where his story would so violently conclude. His childhood was a lonely one, marked by a peculiar and intense fascination with the twin pillars of religion and death. While other boys played games, a young Jim was known to hold elaborate funerals for small animals, delivering passionate, improvised eulogies over their tiny graves. His parents were a study in contrasts. His father, a World War I veteran gassed in the trenches, was a listless presence in the home. His mother, however, was ambitious and believed her son was destined for greatness, a messianic figure in the making. She nurtured his nascent charisma, seeing in his theatrical sermons to neighborhood children the spark of a future leader. This early obsession with control and performance was a clear prelude to what would come. He was a voracious reader, but his interests were narrow and focused. He studied the lives of Stalin, Marx, Mao, and Hitler, not as cautionary tales, but as textbooks. He was dissecting their methods, learning the mechanics of mass persuasion and the architecture of absolute power. He understood, even then, that the most effective leader does not merely command, he provides. He offers a solution to a deep and unspoken need. In the segregated world of 1950s Indiana, Jones found his cause, his entry point into the hearts of the marginalized. He began preaching a message of racial equality and social integration that was, for its time and place, radically progressive. This was the genius of his initial appeal. He didn't begin with prophecies of doom or demands for total loyalty. He began with a promise of belonging. He opened soup kitchens. He helped the poor find housing, and most audaciously, he created one of the first integrated churches in the region. To African-American families facing the daily humiliations of Jim Crow, and to idealistic white liberals alienated by the staid conservatism of mainstream religion, his church felt like a revelation. He named it the People's Temple. The name itself was a masterstroke of branding. It wasn't about God. It was about the people. It was a movement, a community, a family for the dispossessed. And at the head of this family was a father figure who seemed to have all the answers, a charismatic preacher whose voice could soothe and command in equal measure. His services were electric, a potent blend of Pentecostal fervor and socialist doctrine. He would pace the stage, his voice rising from a conspiratorial whisper to a thundering roar. He performed miracles, elaborate acts of faith healing, where he would seemingly pull cancerous tumors from the bodies of his followers. These were, of course, cheap tricks, often using chicken gizzards and other animal parts palmed by his trusted aides. But to a desperate and believing audience, they were proof of his divine power. The healings served a dual purpose. They solidified his status as a conduit of the divine, and they created an atmosphere where questioning him was tantamount to questioning God himself. Doubt was a sin, and critical thinking was a betrayal of the family. Behind the scenes, the mechanisms of control were already being put into place. Members were encouraged, then pressured, to donate their savings, their property, their social security checks to the temple. It was framed as a commitment to the collective, a way to build their socialist utopia. In reality, it was a way to make them financially dependent on Jones, severing their ties to the outside world and making escape a near impossibility. He created a powerful us versus them narrative. The world outside the temple was a cesspool of racism, capitalism, and impending nuclear annihilation. The government, the media, even the families of his followers were portrayed as enemies, intent on destroying their beautiful, egalitarian community. Only within the walls of the temple, under his protection, were they truly safe. This manufactured paranoia was a crucial tool. It isolated his followers, forcing them to rely on each other and, above all, on him for their sense of reality. He was their sole source of information, their protector, their savior. He was slowly, methodically replacing their individual identities with a single collective identity, the People's Temple. By the early 1970s, Jones decided that Indiana was too small a stage for his ambitions. He moved the entire temple, a caravan of buses filled with his most devoted followers, to California. He established churches in San Francisco and Los Angeles, seeing the politically charged and socially liberal climate as a fertile new ground for recruitment. In San Francisco, his political instincts sharpened. He understood that his disciplined, multiracial following represented a powerful and reliable voting bloc. He could deliver hundreds, sometimes thousands, of volunteers or attendees for any political rally or campaign, making him an invaluable ally to the city's political machine. He courted and was courted by the city's most powerful figures. He shared stages with the mayor, the district attorney, and even the First Lady of the United States, Rosalind Carter. He was appointed to the San Francisco Housing Authority Commission, a position of significant influence. To the outside world, Jim Jones was no longer a fringe preacher. He was a respected civic leader, a champion of the poor, and a force for progressive change. But this public image was a carefully constructed facade. Behind the closed doors of the temple, his rule was becoming increasingly tyrannical. The psychological abuse intensified. He would hold marathon meetings, known as catharsis sessions, that could last for days. Followers were forced to publicly confess their deepest fears, insecurities, and transgressions against the temple. These sessions were brutal spectacles of humiliation. Individuals were berated, screamed at, and sometimes physically beaten by other members, all at Jones's direction. It was a way to break down their sense of self, to instill a profound sense of guilt and worthlessness that could only be absolved by him. It also served as a terrifying warning to anyone who might consider stepping out of line. He controlled every aspect of their lives. He dictated who could marry whom, and he would often force couples to separate, claiming it was for the good of the collective. He demanded sexual favors from both male and female followers, framing these encounters as tests of their loyalty. His hypocrisy was staggering. He preached socialism while living lavishly on the money his followers had surrendered. Sleep deprivation became a standard tool of control. The endless meetings, the constant work for the cause, the ever-present fear of being called out for some minor infraction, it all created a state of chronic exhaustion. A sleep-deprived mind is a suggestible mind, less capable of critical thought and more susceptible to indoctrination. As his drug use spiraled, he was heavily dependent on amphetamines to maintain his manic energy. His paranoia deepened. He became convinced that the CIA, the FBI, and a host of other enemies were closing in on him. The dream of a safe haven, a socialist paradise, became an obsession. He needed a place to escape, a place so remote that the outside world could not reach them, a place where he could have absolute, unquestionable control. He found that place in the dense, unforgiving jungles of Guyana, a small socialist nation on the coast of South America. He secured a lease on a remote tract of land and began sending his most loyal followers to carve a settlement out of the wilderness. He called it the People's Temple Agricultural Project. The world would come to know it by a simpler, more infamous name: Jonestown. Jonestown was sold to his followers as the Promised Land, a tropical paradise where they would build a new world free from the evils of American society. It was a powerful and seductive vision, especially for the many African American members who saw it as an escape from a lifetime of racism and a chance to build a truly equal society for their children. But the reality of Jonestown was a nightmare. The work was backbreaking, clearing dense jungle under a sweltering sun, often for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. The food was meager and monotonous, mostly rice and beans, while Jones and his inner circle ate better. The housing was primitive and overcrowded. Disease was rampant. It was a concentration camp disguised as a utopia. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, not to keep intruders out, but to keep the residents in. All communication with the outside world was censored. Letters were read and phone calls were monitored. Jones's voice was a constant presence, broadcast over a network of loudspeakers throughout the settlement, delivering his rambling, drug-fueled sermons day and night. His paranoia had now become the organizing principle of the community. He convinced the residents that they were under constant threat of attack. He would stage false emergencies, waking everyone in the middle of the night with sirens and shouts of, "The mercenaries are coming!" This kept everyone in a state of heightened fear and dependency. It was in this atmosphere of total isolation and terror that he introduced the most terrifying ritual of all, the White Nights. During these rehearsals for a collective suicide, he would announce that their enemies were closing in and that the only honorable way out was a revolutionary act of suicide. Everyone, including the children, would be instructed to line up and drink a red liquid that he told them was poison. They would drink it, believing they were about to die. Then, after a tense and terrifying 45 minutes, he would announce that it was only a test, a drill to prove their loyalty. He was conditioning them, desensitizing them to the idea of suicide, transforming an act of ultimate desperation into an act of ultimate devotion. He was preparing them for the end. By 1978, stories of abuse and imprisonment had begun to leak out of Jonestown. Concerned relatives in the United States, desperate for information about their loved ones, began organizing. They lobbied the government, demanding an investigation into the People's Temple. Their pleas eventually reached a California congressman named Leo Ryan. Ryan was a tenacious and compassionate politician with a reputation for taking on difficult causes. He announced that he would lead a fact-finding mission to Jonestown to investigate the allegations firsthand. He was accompanied by a delegation that included journalists, television crews, and several of the concerned relatives. Jones initially agreed to the visit, seeing it as an opportunity to stage a performance for the cameras and disprove the rumors. When Ryan and his delegation arrived in November 1978, they were greeted with a carefully orchestrated show. They were shown a community that seemed happy, well-fed, and dedicated to their cause. A festive dinner and musical performance were held in their honor. But cracks in the facade quickly began to appear. During the festivities, a journalist was secretly passed a note by a temple member. It read, "Please help me get out of Jonestown." Soon, others came forward, whispering desperate pleas to be taken back to the United States. Ryan realized that the rumors were true, that people were being held against their will. By the next day, the atmosphere had grown tense and hostile. Jones's public charm had evaporated, replaced by a dark and menacing anger. Ryan announced that he would be leaving with any of the Jonestown residents who wished to go. A small but significant group, about 15 people in all, bravely stepped forward, ready to defect. As the delegation and the defectors prepared to leave, the carefully controlled world of Jim Jones began to shatter. The departure was a direct challenge to his authority, an unacceptable breach of his absolute control. He could not allow them to leave and tell the world the truth about his jungle prison. He set in motion a plan to ensure their silence. At the small, remote airstrip at Port Kaituma, as Ryan and his group were boarding their small planes, a tractor-trailer filled with Jones's armed guards, his Red Brigade, roared onto the runway. They opened fire on the planes without warning. The scene was one of utter chaos and terror. Congressman Leo Ryan was shot and killed on the tarmac, along with 4 others, including 3 journalists. The first act of the final massacre had begun. Back at the settlement, Jones knew there was no turning back. He called everyone to the central pavilion. The loudspeakers that once broadcast his sermons now carried a message of finality. He told them that Ryan was dead, that the Guyanese military would soon descend upon them, that they would be tortured, that their children would be taken from them. He presented a twisted, paranoid vision of the future, leaving them with only one option. He told them it was time for the final white night, the revolutionary suicide they had rehearsed so many times. But this time, it would be real. Large vats of grape-flavored punch were brought out, laced with a deadly cocktail of cyanide and sedatives. The final, chilling moments of the People's Temple were captured on an audio recording, a testament to the terrifying power of one man's madness. On the tape, Jones's voice is a strange mix of calm persuasion and frantic urgency. He urges his followers to die with dignity, to not be afraid. When one woman, Christine Miller, bravely speaks up, questioning his plan and pleading for an airlift to Russia instead, she is shouted down by the crowd. The years of conditioning had done their work. Dissent was no longer possible. He ordered the children to be brought forward first. Syringes were used to squirt the poison into the mouths of infants and small children. The sound of parents forcing their children to drink the poison, the crying, the convulsions, it is an almost unbearable sound. The parents then drink the poison themselves, lying down to die alongside their children. In less than an hour, it was over. The pavilion and the surrounding grounds were littered with bodies, a grotesque tableau of death. Over 900 people lay dead, more than 300 of them children. It was the single greatest loss of American civilian life in a deliberate act until the events of September 11, 2001. Jim Jones did not drink the poison. He was found dead in a deck chair overlooking the scene of his final, monstrous act, a single gunshot wound to the head. The ultimate controller, the man who demanded the ultimate sacrifice from his followers, could not bring himself to take the same path. His was an act not of revolutionary suicide, but of cowardly escape. How did this happen? How could one man lead so many people to such a horrific end? The answer lies in the slow, methodical erosion of the self. Jones didn't just demand obedience. He systematically dismantled the identities of his followers. He isolated them, exhausted them, humiliated them, and filled the void with his own voice, his own reality. He offered them a paradise and delivered them to a hell of his own making. The story of Johnstown is not just a story about a cult leader. It's a profound and terrifying cautionary tale about the human need to believe, the danger of surrendering critical thought, and the catastrophic power that can be wielded by a single, dangerous mind. It is a testament to the fact that the path to hell can be paved with the promise of heaven. Our next journey takes us from the jungles of South America to the corridors of power in Africa. Here, we will not find a charismatic preacher promising utopia, but a cold, calculating intellectual, a man of academia who used the tools of sociology and psychology to construct a society built on the very foundation of human division. He was not a cult leader, but the prime minister of a nation. His dangerous idea was not revolutionary suicide, but a meticulously planned, state-sanctioned system of racial oppression. His name was Hendrik Verwoerd, and he is remembered as the architect of apartheid. Hendrik French Verwoerd was not by nature a firebrand orator like Jones. His power came not from emotional sermons, but from the chilling authority of his intellect. Born in the Netherlands in 1901 and immigrating to Southern Africa as a child, he was a product of a world steeped in the anxieties of Afrikaner identity. The Afrikaners, descendants of Dutch settlers, carried with them the scars of their defeat by the British in the Boer Wars and a deep-seated fear of being overwhelmed culturally and politically by the country's black majority. Verwoerd was a brilliant student. He excelled in his studies, eventually earning a doctorate in psychology. In the 1920s, he pursued postgraduate studies in Germany, a nation then grappling with its own questions of national identity and racial purity. While Verwoerd would later deny being influenced by Nazism, his time in a Europe simmering with fascist and eugenicist ideas undoubtedly shaped his worldview. He returned to South Africa not as a politician, but as a professor of applied psychology and later sociology at Stellenbosch University, a major intellectual center of Afrikaner nationalism. It was here, in the quiet halls of academia, that he began to formulate the theories that would provide the intellectual and moral justification for one of the most brutal systems of social engineering in modern history. Verwoerd did not see himself as a racist in the crude, hateful sense. In his own mind, he was a pragmatist, a social scientist solving a complex demographic problem. He argued that the different racial groups in South Africa were so fundamentally different that they could not live together peacefully. Integration, he claimed, would inevitably lead to conflict and the destruction of the Afrikaner culture he held so dear. His proposed solution was not subjugation, he argued, but separation. He called it apartheid, an Afrikaans word meaning apartness or separateness. He framed it as a policy of separate but equal development, a benevolent system that would allow each racial group to develop its own culture and institutions, preserving its unique identity. It was a lie of breathtaking proportions, a clinical, academic justification for white supremacy. His ideas found a receptive audience in the burgeoning Afrikaner nationalist movement. In 1937, he left academia to become the editor of a new nationalist newspaper, Die Transvaaler. For over a decade, he used this platform to relentlessly promote his vision of a racially segregated South Africa. His writing was not filled with impassioned rhetoric, but with the cold, hard logic of a social engineer, presenting apartheid as the only rational, scientific solution to the country's problems. In 1948, the National Party, running on a platform of apartheid, swept to power. Verwoerd was elected to the Senate and was soon appointed Minister of Native Affairs, a position that gave him almost absolute power over the lives of black South Africans. The intellectual architect was now in a position to build his monstrous creation, piece by painstaking piece. With a terrifying, methodical precision, Verwoerd began to construct the legal framework of the apartheid state. This was not a system of casual, customary segregation. It was a labyrinth of laws designed to control every single aspect of a non-white person's life, from birth to death. The Population Registration Act of 1950 was the cornerstone of the entire system. It classified every single South African into one of four racial categories: white, colored, mixed race, Indian, or Bantu, Black African. This classification, often based on arbitrary and humiliating physical examinations, would determine a person's rights, their opportunities, and where they were allowed to live for the rest of their lives. Next came the Group Areas Act, also in 1950. This law geographically segregated the country, allocating specific urban and rural areas for each racial group. The vast majority of the land, including the most fertile farmland and the richest mineral deposits, was reserved for the white minority. Black South Africans, who made up over 80% of the population, were relegated to just 13% of the land. This act led to one of the most brutal chapters of apartheid, the forced removals. Vibrant, multiracial communities like Sophietown in Johannesburg were declared white areas. Residents were given eviction notices and forcibly moved by armed police to desolate, underdeveloped townships on the outskirts of the cities. Their homes, businesses, and communities were bulldozed, their history erased to make way for white settlement. But Verwoerd's vision of control went even deeper. He understood that to maintain power, you must control not just the body, but the mind. In 1953, he introduced the Bantu Education Act, a law that fundamentally reshaped the education system for black children. He was chillingly explicit about its purpose. He stated in a speech, "There is no place for the Bantu in the European community above the level of certain forms of labor. What is the use of teaching the Bantu child mathematics when it cannot use it in practice?" The act was designed to create an education system that would train Black South Africans for a life of servitude, to teach them that their aspirations should be limited to being laborers and domestic workers in a white-dominated economy. It was a form of intellectual strangulation, a deliberate crippling of potential on a massive scale. By denying black children a proper education, Verwoerd was attempting to lock future generations into a permanent state of inferiority, making his vision of a segregated society a self-fulfilling prophecy. Verwoerd's mind was a fortress of conviction. He was utterly impervious to moral arguments or evidence of the immense suffering his policies were causing. He saw the protests, the poverty, the anger, not as a consequence of his system's injustice, but as proof that even stricter controls were needed. He was the detached surgeon, convinced that the pain he was inflicting was necessary for the patient's long-term health. In 1958, Hendrik Verwoerd became the Prime Minister of South Africa. He was now at the apex of power, able to implement his grand vision without restraint. He doubled down on his policies, introducing the Promotion of Bantu Self-Government Act in 1959. This law was the logical and most audacious extension of his separate development ideology. It divided the black population into 8 distinct ethnic groups and created 10 so-called Bantustans or tribal homelands. The government claimed these were independent states where black South Africans could exercise their political rights. In reality, they were impoverished, fragmented, and economically non-viable puppet states, little more than rural slums. The ultimate goal of this policy was to strip every black South African of their citizenship. In Verwoerd's ideal future, there would be no black South Africans. They would all be citizens of these independent homelands, living and working in white South Africa only as temporary guest workers, with no rights and no claim to the country of their birth. It was a bureaucratic and legalistic form of ethnic cleansing. He wasn't rounding people up and killing them in camps. He was erasing them with the stroke of a pen, redefining them out of existence within the borders of their own country. The cruelty of it was matched only by its intellectual arrogance. The growing resistance to apartheid was met with brutal force. On March 21, 1960, in the township of Sharpeville, police opened fire on a crowd of unarmed protesters who were demonstrating against the hated pass laws, which required black citizens to carry identification documents at all times. 69 people were killed, many of them shot in the back as they tried to flee. The Sharpeville massacre sent shockwaves around the world. It exposed the violent reality behind Verwoerd's clinical language of separate development. International condemnation rained down on South Africa. In response, Verwoerd's government banned the main black political organizations, the African National Congress, ANC, and the Pan-Africanist Congress, PAC, driving the anti-apartheid movement underground and into armed struggle. Verwoerd remained defiant. He saw the international outrage not as a reason to reconsider his policies, but as an ignorant intrusion into South Africa's internal affairs. In 1961, he fulfilled a long-held Afrikaner nationalist dream by withdrawing South Africa from the British Commonwealth and declaring it a republic. He was isolating his nation, turning it into a pariah state, all in the service of his ideological obsession. His public persona was that of a calm, professorial, and unshakable leader. He would patiently explain the logic of apartheid to foreign journalists, never raising his voice, never showing a flicker of doubt. It was this very calmness, this intellectual serenity in the face of the chaos and misery he was creating, that made him so profoundly terrifying. He was not a ranting demagogue. He was a soft-spoken architect of human suffering. On September 6, 1966, the architect's work came to a sudden and violent end. As he sat in his seat in the House of Assembly in Cape Town, a parliamentary messenger named Dimitri Tsafandis, a man who had been racially reclassified and suffered under Verwoerd's laws, approached him and stabbed him multiple times with a concealed dagger. Hendrik Verwoerd, the unshakable ideologue, died within minutes on the floor of the parliament where he had built his oppressive state. The legacy of Hendrik Verwoerd did not die with him. The system he designed was so deeply entrenched in the country's legal and social fabric that it would endure for another 3 decades. He had built a prison of the mind for his own people, trapping them in a worldview of fear and racial superiority, and a physical and economic prison for the majority of the country's population. Unlike Jim Jones, who destroyed his followers in a single fiery cataclysm, Verwoerd's destruction was a slow, grinding, generational process. He weaponized the law, sociology, and bureaucracy to inflict misery on a national scale. His story is a chilling reminder that the most dangerous minds are sometimes not the ones that incite chaos, but the ones that meticulously plan and justify order, a cruel, inhuman, and suffocating order. He built a system so logical in its own twisted way that it took the world decades to help dismantle it. From the organized cruelty of a state to the ideological corruption of a science, our final subject takes us to the vast, windswept plains of the Soviet Union. Here, under the iron-fisted rule of Joseph Stalin, a man with little scientific training would rise to become the absolute dictator of Soviet biology. He did not lead a cult or design a political system, but his dangerous ideas, born of ambition and scientific fraud, would create a famine that would kill millions. He was Trofim Lysenko, and his legacy is a testament to the catastrophic consequences of allowing political ideology to declare war on scientific truth. Trofim Denisovich Lysenko was not a brilliant intellectual like Verwoerd, nor a charismatic manipulator like Jones. He was a Ukrainian agronomist from a peasant background, poorly educated but possessed of a shrewd and cunning ambition. His rise to power is a story of being the right man with the right fraudulent ideas in the right place at the most terrifying of times. Stalin had launched his brutal campaign of forced collectivization, seizing land from peasants and forcing them onto massive state-run farms. The policy was a human and agricultural disaster, leading to widespread resistance, the slaughter of livestock, and a catastrophic drop in grain production. Stalin needed a miracle. He needed a scientific breakthrough that would rapidly increase crop yields and prove the superiority of the communist system. Mainstream genetics, the science of Gregor Mendel and Thomas Hunt Morgan, was viewed with suspicion by the Soviet regime. It was seen as a bourgeois science, fatalistic and reactionary. The idea that organisms were prisoners of their genes, that their traits were inherited according to immutable laws, clashed with the core tenets of Marxism-Leninism. The Soviet ideology was built on the belief that the environment was all-powerful, that a new socialist environment could create a new Soviet man. They needed a biology to match this belief. Into this ideological vacuum stepped Trofim Lysenko. In the late 1920s, he began promoting a technique he called vernalization, which involved soaking and chilling wheat seeds before planting to force a winter crop to behave like a spring crop. While the practice itself was not entirely new, Lysenko exaggerated its effectiveness and presented it as a revolutionary discovery that would solve the Soviet Union's food crisis. He was a master of self-promotion and political theater. He presented himself not as an ivory tower scientist, but as a barefoot peasant genius, a man of the soil who understood nature in a way that the formerly trained geneticists did not. His message was simple and appealing. Give us a field, give us the seeds, and we will produce a miracle. His supposed successes, often based on falsified data and small, unrepeatable experiments, were trumpeted by the state-controlled press. He became a Soviet hero, a symbol of the power of practical, proletarian science over the abstract theories of the West. He had caught the attention of the one man who mattered, Joseph Stalin. Emboldened by his growing political support, Lysenko began to attack the entire field of genetics. He dismissed the existence of genes as a fiction, a mystical concept invented by bourgeois scientists. In their place, he promoted his own set of pseudo-scientific theories, which came to be known as Lysenkoism. At the heart of Lysenkoism was the Lamarckian idea that acquired characteristics could be inherited. He claimed, for example, that if you subjected a plant to a certain environmental condition, its offspring would inherit the traits it acquired. He argued by cooperation, not competition, was the driving force of nature, a convenient biological metaphor for the communist state. His theories were, from a scientific standpoint, utter nonsense. They ignored a century of established biological research, but they were politically perfect. They offered the promise of rapid, revolutionary change in agriculture, and they aligned perfectly with the Marxist belief in the power of the environment to reshape life. Lysenko was offering Stalin a biology that was not just useful, but ideologically correct. With Stalin's backing, Lysenko's power grew exponentially. He was made the director of the Institute of Genetics of the USSR Academy of Sciences. He was given control over the Lenin All-Union Academy of Agricultural Sciences. He had become the undisputed dictator of Soviet biology and agriculture. What followed was a reign of terror within the Soviet scientific community. Lysenko launched a brutal campaign to silence any and all opposition. Scientists who dared to defend mainstream genetics were publicly denounced as enemies of the people, saboteurs, and wreckers. They were accused of trying to deliberately undermine Soviet agriculture. This was not merely an academic debate. It was a matter of life and death. Geneticists were fired from their jobs, arrested by the secret police, and sent to the Gulag, Stalin's vast network of labor camps. The most prominent Soviet geneticist of the time, Nikolai Vavilov, was a world-renowned scientist who had created the world's largest collection of plant seeds. He was a true giant of biology. Vavilov openly criticized Lysenko's fraudulent theories. For this crime, he was arrested in 1940, sentenced to death, and ultimately died of starvation in a prison in 1943. His death symbolized the complete destruction of genetics in the Soviet Union. Lysenko and his followers took over scientific journals, universities, and research institutes. Textbooks were rewritten to reflect his theories. An entire generation of Soviet students was taught a fraudulent, politically motivated version of biology. The pursuit of scientific truth was replaced by the enforcement of ideological dogma. Having eliminated all opposition, Lysenko was free to implement his agricultural practices on a massive scale across the Soviet Union. His methods were often bizarre and always disastrous. He ordered farmers to plant seeds very close together, based on his law of the life of species, which claimed that plants from the same class never compete with one another. This led to overcrowding and a catastrophic failure of crops. He promoted unconventional fertilization methods, using dubious soil mixtures. He rejected the use of hybrid corn, a major agricultural innovation in the West, because it was based on the principles of Mendelian genetics that he denied. He sent his followers, often with no real agricultural experience, to manage collective farms with instructions to follow his unproven and unscientific methods. The results were inevitable and devastating. Crop yields plummeted. The agricultural infrastructure, already weakened by collectivization, was pushed to the breaking point. Lysenko's fraudulent science was a direct contributor to the horrific famines that swept through the Soviet Union and other communist countries that adopted his methods. While it is difficult to separate the impact of Lysenko's policies from the broader failures of collectivization, there is no doubt that his war on science exacerbated the food shortages that led to the deaths of millions of people from starvation. In China, Mao Zedong enthusiastically adopted Lysenko's methods during the Great Leap Forward, a decision that contributed to the deadliest famine in human history, with a death toll estimated to be between 15 and 55 million people. Lysenko was the angel of a man-made famine. His dangerous mind did not plot murder or design systems of oppression. Instead, he corrupted the very process of scientific inquiry, replacing evidence and experimentation with political loyalty and ideological fantasy. He offered a simple, magical solution to a complex problem, and in doing so, he led nations down a path of self-inflicted starvation. Even after Stalin's death in 1953, Lysenko's influence lingered. He had become so deeply entrenched in the Soviet system that he retained a position of power under Nikita Khrushchev. It was not until the mid-1960s, after his policies had caused decades of agricultural stagnation and his fraud had become too obvious to ignore, that he was finally disgraced and removed from power. But the damage was done. The Soviet Union, once a pioneer in the field of genetics, had been set back for decades. Generations of scientific talent had been wasted or destroyed, and millions of innocent people had paid the ultimate price for the dangerous ideas of a single ambitious charlatan. Trofim Lysenko's story is a chilling illustration of the danger that arises when science becomes a servant to politics. It shows how a dangerous mind, armed with politically convenient lies, can cause destruction on a scale comparable to any war. He did not need concentration camps or secret police to kill millions. He needed only a flawed theory, a powerful patron, and the silence of those who knew the truth but were too afraid to speak. Jim Jones, Hendrik Verwoerd, Trofim Lysenko, a preacher, a politician, and a scientist. They operated in vastly different arenas, driven by different ambitions. Jones craved adulation and absolute control. Verwoerd sought to build a permanent social order based on his cold, intellectual vision of racial purity. Lysenko was a scientific fraud who craved power and prestige. Yet, they are all bound by a common thread. They are all architects of ruin, whose primary weapons were not bombs or bullets, but the intangible yet immensely powerful force of their own minds. They demonstrate the three primary ways in which intellect can be weaponized beyond the battlefield: through charismatic manipulation, through the cold design of ideology, and through the deliberate corruption of knowledge. Jim Jones took the human need for community, for purpose, for salvation, and twisted it into a tool of personal domination. He built a world for his followers and then demanded they die for it. His was the danger of the seductive lie, the charisma that blinds, the faith that kills. Hendrik Verwoerd took the tools of the state, law, bureaucracy, education, and used them to construct a prison for an entire race. He rationalized bigotry, codified prejudice, and presented oppression as a logical necessity. His was the danger of the orderly evil, the intellectual justification for the inhumane, the tyranny of the tidy mind. Trofim Lysenko took the authority of science and perverted it to serve a political master. He replaced fact with dogma, evidence with loyalty, and in doing so, he starved the very people his ideas were supposed to feed. His was the danger of the useful falsehood, the war on truth that leads to mass death. Their stories are not just relics of a dark past. The patterns of manipulation, ideological certainty, and the rejection of objective truth are all around us, amplified in our modern age by new technologies. The cult-like devotion of online communities, the algorithmic creation of social and political apartheid, the spread of misinformation that undermines science and public health, these are the modern echoes of the dangerous minds of history. The greatest battle is not, and has never been, fought on the fields of war. It is fought in the realm of ideas. It is a constant struggle against the seductive promise of simple solutions, against the comfort of absolute certainty, and against the voices that tell us who to hate, who to fear, and what truths to ignore. The legacies of these men are a permanent warning. They remind us that civilization is fragile, that reason is not a guarantee against barbarism, and that the most important defense we have is the courage to think for ourselves, to question authority, and to hold on to the one thing that all dangerous minds seek to extinguish: a compassionate and uncompromising empathy for our fellow human beings.